This was 1848, the year of the canal and Ogden's Railroad, the year that Chicago began to use its strategic location to build a commercial empire that would change America. The year the young city opened its first important factory on the north side of the river. In 1831, Cyrus Hall McCormick, son of a Virginia farmer, had built a primitive reaper, overcoming problems that had plagued farmers for centuries, cutting grain by hand, one hand with a sickle, two with a scythe. He sensed the best market for his reaper would be farther west, on the vast wheat fields of Illinois.
Farmers would set in a wheat crop. That's no problem. The planting, it's the harvesting that's the problem. They're out there with their boys and their cousins and a couple of their neighbors cutting wheat with a sickle and a scythe. And they can't cut the wheat fast enough. And a lot of the wheat simply dies in the field. And McCormick, when he toured on foot the Midwest, saw this happening, saw farmers losing because they couldn't bring in the wheat fast enough. And here he sees a great chance.
The first year, McCormick made 450 reapers, none the same, each blade forged by hand. With 120 employees, he was Chicago's largest employer. But no one worked harder. There by the furnace fire, begrimed with coal and dust, decorated with an apron of leather, wrote the Chicago Daily Journal, stood the one in charge of it all, Cyrus Hall McCormick. The paper called the reaper a mechanical man. It freed farmers worldwide from their bondage to the sickle and scythe and helped open the Midwest. Chicago revolutionized not only the production of grain, but how it was transported and traded. Farmers who cut grain with McCormick's first reapers loaded their sacks onto wagons and headed off to a stream. There, the grain would be reloaded onto rafts and floated downriver until it reached the Mississippi.
Once these rafts have reached the Mississippi, all the grain is taken off from the sacks, loaded onto the shore of the river, and then they're carried once again into the holds of small boats that are on the upper Mississippi River, and there they are carried on down to St. Louis, where they're unloaded yet again, put out onto the levee in St. Louis, and then loaded yet again by hand in somebody's back, carried onto a larger steamship, which will carry it on down to New Orleans, where it's unloaded yet again, and they'll put onto an ocean-going vessel to New York or to the North Atlantic economy and on to Europe. There's a huge amount of labor cost, and so this is a very expensive way to move grain.
The railroad overcame the constraints of geography. As plank roads had reached out to farmers a few miles, railroads from Chicago reached out hundreds of miles, cutting into the hinterland of St. Louis. In the decade after Ogden's Chicago and Galena Union headed out toward the Mississippi, New York investors financed railroads that spread out from Chicago like tentacles. By 1856, Chicago had become the railroad hub of America.
What made Chicago so special was that the web of railroads that were being projected west dumped everything into Chicago's lap. It became the funnel that delivered an entire ecosystem, the entire western landscape, into the waiting markets of the eastern seaboard of the United States and of Europe.
They seem so commonplace today, the picturesque hallmark of every rural town. But in the 19th century, the grain elevator was a revolutionary technology that transformed the handling of grain around the world and doomed the sack. Grain elevators were developed in Buffalo. Chicago built its first in 1848. By 1858, 12 mammoth grain houses dominated its skyline. When poet Carl Sandburg called Chicago a stacker of wheat, he was referring to grain elevators, the city's first skyscrapers. Grain flowed from the elevators into the holds of lake boats to be shipped east, where it was refined. What became a golden stream in Chicago still moved by sack on the backs of laborers in St. Louis. In the 1840s, it had taken an Irish crew all day to load a boat with 7,000 bushels of wheat. A decade later, the same amount could be loaded in an hour by one man. Six years after its canal, first railroad, and grain elevator, Chicago surpassed St. Louis in the grain trade. 10 years after McCormick built his factory, the Mississippi Valley was the world's largest food-producing region. Chicago became known as the Great Reaper City. Its port replaced Archangel and Odessa in Russia as the greatest grain port in the world. The Chicago River became a mammoth exchange engine. Ships heading east with grain from the west passed fleets carrying lumber from the north. Its location on the southern tip of Lake Michigan made a lumber market possible. Farmers in the fertile but treeless prairies hungered for lumber, for fences and barns. It came from the north end of the lake, where the white pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin seemed endless. By the time of the Civil War, Chicago had become the largest lumber market in the world.
The scene on the south branch of the Chicago River, you cannot witness anymore. It does not exist in Chicago. It doesn't exist, actually, I think, anywhere in the world. Stack after stack after stack of lumber, all waiting to be shipped on downstate in Illinois, out to Iowa, on to Nebraska or Kansas. A whole district just devoted to stacked lumber.
There are cases where entire prairie families are standing out there in this windswept prairie bog, waiting for their town to arrive. Bar, chapel, houses, it's already made in Chicago. It's stamped on it, made in Chicago, along with the reapers and everything else. They're just standing there with their kids, you know, waiting for that train. Here comes the town.
Within a single generation, Chicago had turned the tall grass prairies, the earthly paradise Joliet and Marquette had admired, into the American Midwest.